A racist cop yells at a black woman in public, berating her with rude and unjust accusations. He assumes that his badge gives him the right to treat her however he pleases, until the woman calmly reaches into her bag and pulls out her ID. What happens next will leave the officer speechless and force you to question who really holds the power in situations like this. Karma strikes fast and hard, and the officer's arrogance evaporates in an instant. Stay tuned to find out how one simple moment of dignity shatters his authority. It was a regular afternoon in the heart of the city, with pedestrians weaving through the busy streets and the hustle and bustle of urban life filling the air. People hurried to their destinations, unaware of the tense encounter that was about to unfold. The woman walking down the sidewalk didn't seem to be in any particular rush, her steps purposeful, yet calm. Dressed casually, her confidence was unmistakable. She was a woman who knew her worth, and her composure spoke volumes about the strength she carried within. Unbeknownst to her, her path was about to cross with someone who carried a very different energy, Officer Matthews. He was a middle-aged cop with a tough exterior, always quick to assert his dominance. For years, he had used his badge to intimidate and control, assuming that his uniform gave him the right to treat people as he saw fit. He had a reputation in the precinct for being quick to judge and slow to show empathy. Today, however, his arrogance would be met with something he never expected. As the woman walked past him, the officer's eyes locked on her. His gaze wasn't one of curiosity or respect, but rather one of suspicion and bias. Without any reason, he stepped forward, blocking her path, his posture rigid and his tone condescending. "Hey, you there," he called out, his voice sharp. "What are you doing here? This isn't a place for people like you." The woman paused, slightly taken aback by the officer's tone, but she didn't let it show. She hadn't done anything wrong, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by an officer who clearly thought he was above everyone else. The streets around them were crowded, but for some reason, Officer Matthews had decided she was his target today. "Excuse me?" the woman replied calmly, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of confusion and quiet confidence. "I'm just walking down the street. I haven't done anything wrong." But Matthews wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. He was in the mood to throw his weight around, to make sure she knew who was in charge. "I don't think you belong here," he sneered, taking a step closer, his voice rising. "Show me some ID. I need to make sure you're not causing trouble." At that moment, the air between them shifted. The crowd nearby began to sense something wasn't right. Some people stopped and watched, a few shaking their heads at the officer's rude behavior. But the woman, rather than becoming flustered or angry, remained calm. She wasn't just walking down the street. She was about to teach this officer a lesson in respect. As Officer Matthews continued to stand in her way, the woman felt the eyes of the growing crowd on her. She could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the collective tension rising with each passing moment. The officer's voice had now taken on an edge of command, as though he was used to people simply backing down when he raised his authority. But the woman was not like most people he had encountered. Her calmness only seemed to infuriate him more. "I said, show me your ID," Officer Matthews barked, his tone more forceful now. He reached for his belt, his fingers hovering over his radio, as though he were preparing to escalate the situation even further. The woman stood still, her posture unchanged. She didn't take a step back, didn't flinch. Her steady gaze met his without hesitation. She had been here before, had faced similar attempts at intimidation from others like him. But today, she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of playing into his hands. "I'm not giving you anything, officer," she said firmly, her voice carrying a quiet power. "I'm just trying to go about my day. I'm not breaking any laws." Her words, delivered with such poise, seemed to be lost on Matthews, who was now visibly frustrated. The more she refused to comply, the angrier he got. He began pacing in front of her, muttering under his breath, "Typical. Think you can just walk around without being questioned?" he grumbled, as if the woman's mere presence on the street was somehow an offense. The crowd around them began to shift uncomfortably. Some were whispering, others now openly recording the interaction on their phones. A few murmurs could be heard in the background. People were starting to realize that something wasn't right. But none of them dared to intervene, at least not yet. Everyone was unsure how far this officer would take it. Matthews took another step toward her, this time raising his voice even further, trying to assert complete dominance over the situation. "You don't get to ignore me, lady. I'm trying to help you out here, but you're making this difficult." The woman stood her ground, her expression unchanging. "Help me out? By what? Intimidating me and demanding my identification for no reason?" Her words were measured, but they hit with precision, striking at the heart of the officer's arrogance. Her calmness seemed to throw Matthews off even more. He wasn't used to being challenged. To him, the power dynamic was supposed to be simple. He was the officer, and she was just a civilian meant to comply. He had expected her to be frightened or confused, but that was far from the case. The officer's frustration grew, and without thinking, he grabbed his coffee cup from the side of his car. The hot drink was still steaming, and with a sudden, rash motion, he raised it and threw the coffee at the woman in front of him. The hot liquid splashed across her jacket, drenching her. The crowd gasped, some of them pulling out their phones in shock, others watching in disbelief. The woman, however, didn't flinch. She stood still, wiping the coffee off her jacket with slow, deliberate movements. There was no outburst, no reaction of anger or panic, just a calm response to an over-the-top act of aggression. Matthews watched her for a moment, expecting her to react as most people would, shocked, angry, or begging for an apology. But instead, she simply wiped her jacket clean, her calm demeanor unwavering. He stepped back, now feeling uneasy, as the tension in the air thickened. The bystanders were starting to murmur among themselves. Some were glaring at him, while others exchanged glances, their discomfort with the situation evident. Matthews's earlier sense of control was slipping away, and the more the woman remained calm, the more uneasy he became. "Is that all you have to say?" Matthews sneered, his voice tinged with frustration. He was desperate for a reaction from her, a sign of weakness. But she gave him nothing. "You're just going to stand there and take it?" "I'm not taking anything," she replied quietly, her eyes now locked on his. "But I think you've taken enough of my time, and I think it's time you take responsibility for your actions." The woman reached into her bag, and Matthews, still seething with anger, couldn't help but wonder what she was doing. Was she pulling out a phone to file a complaint? Was she about to escalate things further? But what happened next stunned him. She pulled out her ID, not just any ID, but one that had the power to stop him in his tracks. The badge she held was one that carried weight far beyond his own, one that made him freeze on the spot. Matthews stared at the badge, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, he couldn't even find the words to speak. The woman held the badge up, its shining surface catching the light in such a way that Matthews couldn't help but stare. His mouth went dry, and his hands instinctively dropped to his sides as he processed what had just unfolded. This wasn't just any ordinary ID. This was a badge that signified authority far beyond his own. His mind raced as the reality of the situation hit him, but it was too late to undo the damage he had already done. For a moment, all that could be heard was the low murmur of the crowd around them. The world seemed to pause as Matthews tried to gather himself. His mind was scrambling to find a way to navigate the sudden shift in power. He had assumed she was just another regular citizen he could push around. But now, he was faced with someone who was not only his equal, but someone who could control the very course of his future. What? Matthews stammered, his voice shaky. He couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. This can't be real. The woman, still calm and composed, glanced at him, and then looked at the crowd as if to gauge their reaction. The air between them was thick with tension, and Matthews could feel his earlier bravado slipping away with every second that passed. "You're right," she said, her voice cool but firm. "This isn't real, at least not in the way you thought it was. You assumed you could treat me any way you liked because I was just a face in the crowd. But I'm not just anything." She held up the badge once again, this time with a more deliberate motion, as if making sure everyone around her knew exactly what it meant. Matthew's face flushed as the truth began to settle in. He didn't just pick the wrong person to bully, he had picked the wrong person to mess with. His jaw clenched, and his hands balled into fists at his sides, but it was clear the confidence he had been riding on for so long had completely evaporated. His voice wavered as he tried to backpedal. I didn't know who you were," he said, his eyes darting nervously from her to the onlookers. He was desperate to find some way out of this, but there was no escape. "I didn't mean to. I just thought you were, another troublemaker." But the woman wasn't letting him off the hook. She didn't flinch or react with anger. Instead, her voice remained steady, unwavering. "You didn't mean to," she repeated, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't mean to throw coffee at me. Didn't mean to question my presence. Didn't mean to disrespect me in front of others. You didn't mean any of that." The officer's face turned redder by the second. The shift in power was so stark that he couldn't even come up with an excuse that made sense. He had taken one too many liberties with his badge. One too many moments of using his position to belittle others. Now, the consequences of his actions were crashing down on him. "I didn't think you'd—" Matthews began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The words seemed meaningless now. Nothing could undo what had just transpired. "Think. That's the problem," the woman interjected, cutting him off. "You didn't think. You never stopped to consider that maybe the person you're trying to intimidate has more power than you realize. You didn't stop to think about what happens when people like you use their badges to control others with no accountability." The crowd, now fully engaged, began murmuring in agreement. A few people stepped forward offering quiet words of support, while others simply watched in stunned silence, unable to look away from the unfolding drama. They had all seen his arrogant behavior, and now they were witnessing the moment of reckoning. Harris took a shaky step back, his head hanging low in defeat. The woman didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to scream. Her authority and calmness were enough to dismantle the officer's arrogance. With a final glance at the stunned onlookers and Matthews, the woman took out her phone and made a quick call. It wasn't just to report the incident. It was to ensure that this kind of behavior didn't go unchecked. Matthews had overstepped in a major way, and she wasn't about to let him get away with it. Within moments, the wheels of accountability were set in motion. She wasn't done yet. She wasn't about to let this officer's behavior be swept under the rug. "You'll be hearing from my department," she said as she tucked her phone away. "This will not go unnoticed, and I will make sure you answer for this. The officer stood frozen, unable to respond. And, as the crowd began to disperse, the shock of the situation still hanging in the air, Matthews realized just how deeply his actions had impacted his future. His behavior had been witnessed, recorded, and reported. It wasn't just about the incident anymore. It was about a broader issue of power and accountability. The woman didn't wait for him to apologize. She didn't need it. Her quiet strength and composed response had already delivered the most important message of all. Abuse of power, no matter the authority, would never go unchallenged. As the woman walked away from Officer Matthews, the energy in the air shifted. The crowd, which had initially been hesitant, now erupted in whispers. Some people had pulled out their phones to capture the exchange, and the footage was already making its rounds on social media. It wasn't just a confrontation. It was a moment of public reckoning. What Matthews had assumed was a simple power play had turned into something far bigger. The officer stood there, speechless and humiliated, while the woman's calm authority seemed to echo through the streets. She didn't look back at him as she walked away, but her message had been delivered. She wasn't interested in drama or confrontation. She was simply holding someone accountable for their actions. For Matthews, however, this was far from over. The woman had made sure he would face the consequences of his abuse of power, and he knew that no apology could undo the damage he had caused. Minutes later, the sound of sirens broke through the stillness of the street. It wasn't an accident or a typical police response. It was a higher-ranking officer arriving to assess the situation. The officer who had initially thrown the coffee at the woman was now under the spotlight, and the gravity of the moment had finally sunk in for him. What he hadn't anticipated, what he hadn't even thought possible, was the fact that the woman he had so casually disrespected was far more influential than he could have ever guessed. And now, his actions were under immediate scrutiny. The officer's mind raced. He knew this wouldn't blow over. His superior officers were already aware of the incident, thanks to the video footage that was circulating online. What had been a simple act of aggression was now a viral moment that no one would let go of. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was now at risk. As his superior officer approached him, Matthews's first instinct was to defend his actions, to justify his behavior, but he quickly realized how pointless that would be. The evidence was undeniable. The woman hadn't provoked him. She hadn't given him a reason to treat her the way he did. His bias, his assumptions, and his abuse of power had exposed him as a danger to the very public he was meant to protect. In a matter of hours, Matthews's world crumbled. His internal affairs investigation was launched, and the department quickly moved to suspend him while they reviewed his record. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge. Matthews had a long history of similar behavior, using his badge to intimidate those he deemed inferior. The investigation into his past actions revealed a disturbing pattern of discrimination and abuse of power. What had been an isolated incident now looked like just another link in a much larger chain of misconduct. The woman, meanwhile, remained unshaken by the fallout. She wasn't in this for personal gain, nor was she looking to make an example of Matthews. She simply wanted accountability. Her role in this moment was not about playing hero. It was about doing what was right. She had handled the situation with grace, but she had made it clear that she wouldn't let anyone abuse their power, regardless of their position. Her calm response to Matthew's aggressive actions had sent a clear message. Standing up to injustice didn't always require loud confrontation or violence. It could be done with quiet authority and dignity. And that message wasn't just resonating with the crowd that had witnessed the incident. It was spreading across social media and news outlets, creating a wave of support for her stance. As Matthews faced the fallout from his actions, the woman's name began to appear in the media. Interviews followed, not because she was seeking attention, but because her actions had sparked something larger. Her story became a symbol of standing up against abuse of power, and soon calls for reform began to echo in the streets. People were tired of seeing authority figures misuse their positions. They were ready to speak out. The police department, under increasing pressure, began to examine its practices more closely. The incident had pushed them to reconsider how officers were trained, how power was distributed, and how people in positions of authority should be held accountable. The woman's voice, quiet yet powerful, became part of the growing movement to make law enforcement more just and more transparent. As Matthews' career spiraled, the woman continued to use her platform to advocate for the changes she believed in. She pushed for more oversight of law enforcement officers, stronger policies on racial profiling, and the implementation of training programs that emphasized empathy and respect. She was focused not on the downfall of one officer, but on creating a lasting change in the system. For Matthews, the regret was too late. He had allowed his prejudice and arrogance to get the best of him, and now he was paying the price. His suspension turned into a permanent dismissal from the force, and his reputation was tarnished beyond repair. His downfall wasn't just the result of one bad decision. It was the consequence of years of unchecked behavior that finally caught up to him. As the investigation into Matthews continued, the woman's actions were recognized not just as an isolated act of bravery, but as a catalyst for change. Her ability to remain calm and collected in the face of aggression had forced the system to confront its own failures. The ripple effect from that moment of confrontation would continue to spread, leading to real conversations about how to address abuses of power and how to make the justice system work for everyone. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the consequences of the officer's actions would ripple far beyond just his career. The community had begun to rally behind the woman who had stood her ground, not out of a desire for personal gain, but because of the larger message she had sent. Her quiet strength had exposed the toxic behavior of an officer who had felt untouchable. And now, as the details of his past misconduct came to light, the public demanded answers. Matthews' suspension had quickly escalated into a formal dismissal. The investigation revealed numerous incidents of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct, none of which had been properly addressed until now. His actions had been allowed to slide under the radar for years, shielded by his position and the protection that often accompanies power. But the woman's resolve had shifted everything. His arrogance was no longer the dominant force. It was now exposed for what it truly was, a symptom of a much deeper issue within the system. The police department was under intense scrutiny. The incident had sparked conversations not just about Matthews's actions, but about the way the entire force handled issues of racial bias, accountability, and power. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to misconduct began speaking out. Officers with integrity and compassion were now leading the charge for reform, supported by the growing public demand for change. The woman, who had been the catalyst for this shift, was now being recognized not for the confrontation itself, but for the calm, dignified way she had handled it. Her decision to stand up for herself, to remain calm and unshaken, had turned what could have been a chaotic, emotionally charged incident into a moment of clarity. She hadn't raised her voice or demanded revenge. She had simply asserted her right to be treated with respect, and in doing so, had shown everyone that this was about more than just her personal experience. It was about justice, fairness, and holding those in power accountable for their actions. As the woman continued to advocate for police reform, she also used her platform to talk about the broader implications of what had occurred. She spoke about the importance of standing up against injustice, about the need for strong community oversight, and about how everyone, no matter their position or title, needed to be held accountable for their actions. The more she spoke, the more her message resonated with people across the country. They saw her as a symbol of courage, someone who wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. The conversations sparked by the incident began to shift the tide. Citizens who had felt powerless to challenge law enforcement now found their voices. They shared their own stories of abuse, profiling, and mistreatment at the hands of officers who believed they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. What had started as one woman standing up to one officer had evolved into a national dialogue about the future of law enforcement and the role of the community in holding officers accountable. The officer, meanwhile, was left to reflect on what had transpired. His career was over, his reputation in tatters. But more than that, the reality of his actions was starting to hit him. He had been so focused on his sense of superiority, on using his badge as a tool for control, that he had never considered the harm he was causing. The power he had enjoyed for so long had evaporated in an instant, and now he was just another example of someone who had failed to recognize the importance of respect and fairness. As Matthews grappled with the consequences of his behavior, the woman's life continued. She didn't seek fame, and she didn't need validation. She was focused on the long-term goal of creating a system that worked for everyone. She continued to push for policy changes, supporting legislation that would hold officers accountable, and implementing training programs that focused on anti-bias practices and emotional intelligence. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the officers' actions weren't just viewed as one bad apple, but as part of a larger, systemic issue that needed to be addressed. The department eventually implemented changes, driven by public pressure and the undeniable need for reform. Officers were required to undergo more rigorous training, and new systems for accountability were put in place. The woman's role in these reforms was acknowledged, but she remained humble, knowing that the real victory was in the progress that was being made, not in the personal recognition she had received. For the community, the shift in mindset was profound. People began to believe that change was possible, that standing up for what's right didn't have to be dramatic or violent. It could be done with quiet, unshakable resolve. The woman's actions proved that one person could make a difference, that standing up to abuse of power didn't require an escalation of violence, but an elevation of dignity and strength. Through this incident, the public had learned that accountability wasn't something to be feared. It was a responsibility shared by all, and no one, not even the people entrusted with power, should be above it. It was a lesson that was felt deeply by the community, and one that would continue to resonate for years to come. The moment the officer's career crumbled became a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire community. What began as a confrontation between one man's misuse of power and one woman's calm dignity had sparked a chain reaction of reflection, dialogue, and change. The woman's actions, though quiet and composed, sent a clear message to everyone. When we stand firm against injustice, when we refuse to allow abuse of power to continue unchecked, we can spark the kind of change that shapes the future. The officer's actions will be remembered not because of the position he once held, but because of the undeniable lesson he taught us all: respect for others, empathy, and accountability are non-negotiable, regardless of one's rank or title. His downfall wasn't just a consequence of his own choices, it was a reminder that those in power must always answer for their actions, and those who hold authority over others should be held to the highest standards. As for the woman, her story is far from over. Her efforts to change the system continue, and her role in this movement will serve as a beacon for others who have experienced injustice and want to see the world change for the better. Her story is proof that one voice, one act of standing up for what is right, can spark a ripple effect of change that resonates through entire communities. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up against injustice or abuse of power? How did you handle it? Let us know in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible moments of courage, accountability, and justice. Let's continue to push for a world where fairness and respect are the norm, not the exception. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more empowering stories that inspire us all to act with integrity and stand up for what's right.